Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. It looks like we are a pretty stable group of attendees, so I think we can get started. This is the California System Performance Measures walkthrough webinar. It's jointly hosted by Cal ICH and Apt Associates. And we are going to get started. So I'm going to pass it over to Cal ICH and Amber.
Thank you so much, Melissa. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for joining us for a walkthrough of the most recent release of the baseline data for California System Performance Measures. My name is Amber Ostrander, and I am the Chief of Grant Operations and Support at Cal ICH and have had the pleasure of watching the evolution of the California System Performance Measures. This has been a big effort between Cal ICH and our partners at Apt Associates. The Cal ICH Data and Research Team, led by Sydney Bennett, HDIS team led by Abigail Aquino, and Apt Associates have listened to grantee feedback and worked tirelessly to improve the data surrounding SPMs in order to provide our grantees with the most beneficial data possible. This is a continued effort, and we appreciate your patience and feedback through this process. Here joining me today are our partners at Apt Associates. This is a big team led by Jules Brown and Melissa Stevenson. They will also be walking through the most significant improvements made and the template itself. If we have time at the end of the presentation, we will try to answer as many questions as possible, but there will also be other opportunities for questions at later dates through the technical assistance we are offering and will go over later. Next slide. So an introduction of the California System Performance Measures, giving some background on that. The HAP3 statute required Cal ICH to create California SPMs based on HUD's SPMs to create a standardized set of metrics to help the state and local jurisdictions assess progress towards preventing, reducing, and ending homelessness. Cal ICH first released California SPM data for 2018 through 2020 for HAP3, and then provided California SPM data for 2021 for HAP4. While California SPMs are based on HUD SPMs, they have several key differences that will be highlighted later. The California SPMs are generated using data from the HDIS system, also known, well, it's known as HDIS, it's known as the Homeless Data Integration System, which aggregates and processes data from the state's 44 COCs, HMIS systems. This allows measures to look at the services clients access through COCs in the state. The California SPM spreadsheet provides each continuum of care data on each of the 6 California SPMs, as well as data on populations that have been underserved and disproportionately impacted by homelessness. Next slide, please. Listed here are the 6 California System Performance Measures, along with the 7th listed, which is racial and ethnic disparities for measures 1 through 6 for specific population groups. Now I will turn it over to Melissa Stevenson from Apt Associates to walk through the most significant improvements we have made to the California SPMs.
Hi, thanks, Amber. My name is Melissa Stevenson. I'm with Apt Associates, as Amber mentioned. I am going to talk through I'm going to talk through the SPMs, but first let's go over some of the most significant improvements that have been made to the SPM since the original version last year. So the following types of improvements were applied to the SPMs after that initial baseline data was generated last year and was provided to you all as HAP grantees. So starting with values for destination and enrollments. So destination is the exit destination where folks exit their projects to in HMIS. There were some exits where we reset the exit dates based on the buffer and breaks concepts, which are we go into more detail in some of the supporting documents. So if I say anything here that you're not sure what I'm talking about, I would recommend you check there. But one of the improvements we made was when we reset the exit dates, now the exit destinations are going to be reset to unknown for those in very specific situations. Also, people who were housed all year in a permanent housing project, which means that they had actually moved into permanent housing before that report period even started, and they hadn't exited during the report period, meaning these are people who were permanently housed throughout the year in HMIS. Those are now excluded from most measures. There were some cases where, due to some conflicting data in different projects, they were getting picked up in some of the measures. So we've corrected that. There are enrollments where the exit date is before the entry date, which is not possible in reality, but sometimes the data in some systems was getting entered incorrectly, maybe some typos. Clearly, those are invalid data because a person can't exit before they enter. So those are now excluded. There are values for current living situation, prior living situation, and the housing move-in date. It used to be that we were looking at every household member for the information, but per the HUD data standards, those fields are only required to be collected as for the head of household. So now the code for the SPMs has been updated so that all the household members we're now using the current living situation, prior living situation, and any housing move-in dates, if any, for that head of household for all household members. So you'll see some improvements in the data there. And then the calculation for measure 3, which is system exits, that was updated to include people who moved into their housing units, while they were still enrolled in an HMIS participating permanent housing project in the system. So we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get to that measure, and you can see how that might impact your data. So before I dive into the walking through each measure and looking at the SPM template, just a few little logistics. I hope some of you have been on some of the other WebEx office hours that we posted for AB 977, but if you haven't and you're not sure how to get the Q&A box showing on WebEx, sometimes it's a little hidden. We're going to use that Q&A to so you can submit your questions and we can respond there. So you can see on the screen in the lower right-hand corner, there should be 3 little dots. If you click on those dots, it'll pull up a menu that you can see here on the right on the slide. It'll pull up a menu and you click on the Q&A selection in that menu, and then you will see the Q&A box on your screen. It is possible in some versions those 3 dots might show up somewhere else, but we've been able to find it that way. So if you're having any tech problems though, you can just drop it in the chat and we'll have our events services person help you out with that. Yeah, and we will also share the slide. So I'm going to go into the California system performance measures, so the SPMs, as well as the template that you have received and you will receive in the future with the data for your SPMs. So first, an overview of the CA SPMs. So the template, the top line tab, this tab includes all of the 6 system performance measures. So those 6 measures that Amber mentioned on an earlier slide, you'll see on that top line tab data for calendar years 2020, 2021, and 2022. So you'll be able to compare across those 3 years, and you'll also see the percentage change between those years as well. So you can use that to kind of track your progress towards those SPMs. There's also detail tabs for all 3 years included in this round of the report, 2020, 2021, and 2022. So there's a separate tab for each year with details. That's supporting data by project type, as well as some other attributes, which we'll talk a little bit more about as we proceed through this webinar. And that information is there to help you kind of understand the top line numbers and give you some more context as well. The detail tabs also include data for specific population groups. That's the measure 7 that you'll hear us refer to. That measure 7 breaks out the data for the 6 top line system performance measures by household composition, gender, ethnicity, and race, as well as some other population demographics and characteristics. And so, as I said in the slides that follow, we're going to walk through that top line tab and explain each measure. And we'll also give some brief overviews of the detail tabs for each measure. All right, so this is a little snapshot of the what you'll see in the top line tab. And the data I'm showing here is not real. It doesn't belong to anyone. So if any of it doesn't seem realistic to you, don't worry. And this is just to give you a sense of what you're going to see when you look at your template. So the tab includes information to allow you as the HAP grantees to track your progress towards each of the California system performance measures. There's also updated calendar year 2020 and 2021 data. So you previously received data for 2020 and 2021, but this updated data in this version of the template will include all those improvements that I talked about in the prior slide. So your data will look a little different in many cases, not in all, but in many cases. So it'll have all those methodology changes and updates to the data, any updates that COCs made to the data in the meantime as well. And then we're also including on the top line tab your 2022 data. And like I said, that can be used to track your progress towards those each of those SPMs. So I'm going to go through measure 1, which is composed of a 1A and 1B, and then I'll turn it over to Jules to talk through the detail tab on those measures. So first, 1A is the number of people accessing services who are experiencing homelessness. So that's everyone who experienced homelessness in your system based on data in your HMIS and then in HDIS during the reporting period. So you'll have everyone for 2020, 2021, and 2022, and then you can see the changes between those years as well. People are only counted once in this measure, so if anyone was in the system in multiple projects or in different project types, or they move, as people do move through the system in HMIS, we're only counting them once. So it's going to include everyone who was enrolled in emergency shelters, safe havens, and transitional housing during the year. That's pretty straightforward. It also includes people who were enrolled in permanent housing, and that includes permanent supportive housing, rapid rehousing, as well as other permanent housing projects. And they're only included in this measure if they experienced homelessness at any point during the report period. Meaning if they had already moved into housing before the report period started and they were housed the entire time, they are not counted in measure 1. But if they have that time between when they enrolled in those permanent housing projects and when they actually moved into a housing unit during the year, if that time is during the year, then they are counted in measure 1. And it also includes people enrolled in non-residential projects. Those project types are street outreach, coordinated entry, day shelters, other and services only. If during that enrollment or within a time buffer before or after, if they have a documented homeless living situation during the year. So not everyone who was enrolled in those projects are necessarily going to be counted in measure 1A. It really depends on if those homeless living situations were documented. So a lot of this may be familiar to some of you. That kind of high level information hasn't changed since the original SPMs. However, there are some refinements, which we discussed on a prior slide, and improvements. related to applying those living situations to all household members. So every member of a household has the same current living situation or prior living situation as the head of household. And then also correcting some data, some of the data that might have some data entry errors around, like I mentioned, having an exit date before your entry date, or some enrollments that did not end before a project closed. So you had a project that closed, but it looked like people were still enrolled. So we corrected those. And then also dealing with some of those missing exit destinations. So then I'll just talk about 1B real quick because this one's pretty straightforward, and then I'll let Jules talk about the details for measure 1A. 1B is the estimated number of people experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and that comes from the COC's annual point in time count, or PIT count. So it's just people experience unsheltered homelessness. This is the only measure that does not come from HDIS or your HMIS. This is from that PIT count reported to HUD. And you'll see that 2021 is not included because that was not required during that year due to COVID-19. Actually, sorry, before I turn it to Jules, I'm going to talk about measure. Oh, do you want to go? Go ahead.
Yeah, why don't I? You've been talking for a long time, and I'm happy to pick this one up. And in some senses, measure 2 is a subset, is one of the detail aspects of measure 1. So when we just focus on measure 1A, which is sourced from HMIS, kind of disregarding that measure 1B, which looks at the PIT count. Measure 2 is a subset of those folks. So anyone who kind of falls into that landscape that Melissa described, anyone who meets those qualifications would fall into measure 2 if, looking back 2 years prior to their first contact with the system in the report period, that they have not had a previous enrollment in the HMIS anywhere in California. So this is measure 2, people who are entering the system newly homeless. They're experiencing homelessness for the first time, and that's how that's defined, as that 2-year look back period. And that's consistent with HUD's definition of newly homeless that they used to use on those quarterly pulse reports. And it just sort of gives a nice period of time to look back on. Then if you look at your actual detail tab, and we can go on to the next slide here, Melissa, what you'll see is a breakdown of both measures 1A and measure 2 combined together. So this detail tab shows you in the first column a breakout of all of those people who started the year homeless. They were already homeless. They're actively enrolled in a project on that first day of the year. And break them down into 2 kind of breakout groups. One is those who were enrolled in residential projects only. Those were enrolled in non-residential projects only. So those were just contacted by street outreach, day shelters, etc. And then those who appeared in both. So this breakout in this sort of second, the first line shows you the top. That's the top line. That should match the top line tab on your spreadsheet. And then the 3 rows below that break that out. And so the first column breaks out those who were started the year homeless. And then the second column shows you those folks who are newly entering. So those are the folks who are counted in measure 2. Then there's another subset, it's sort of the opposite group of those who are shown in measure 2. This is another interesting group, not one of the top line measures, not one of the SPMs that's sort of designated by the state, but also an interesting group. This is those who are returning. So those who have had an enrollment in the prior 2 years and are now back in the system. And then all together, those folks sum up to that last column, which is the total number of people experiencing homelessness. And that is also broken out. And then below that, it's broken out into those. So just these top 3 rows should add, in this top section, the lower of 3 rows should add up to that top row, because this is a mutually exclusive categorization. Down in this bottom section, these are not mutually exclusive. This is any of the enrollments that the person has experienced during the report period. So anything if they contacted a street outreach project and another kind of project, they would appear in that top row. SO is street outreach. And if they appeared in coordinated entry, which is that second row, CE, then they would also appear there. But again, they're broken out by their various measures, and you can see the folks who appear in measure 2 in that second column, and the folks that appear in measure 1A in that fourth column. So that's what you'll see in that breakout for measures 1 and 2, and that can help you understand, of those folks who are experiencing homelessness in your system, where are they being seen? All right, and now we'll shift over to Melissa again to talk about exits.
Thanks, Jules. So yes, I'm going to talk about measure 3, which is often shorthanded to system exits, but officially it's the number of people exiting homelessness into permanent housing. That measure includes everyone who exited homelessness by moving into permanent housing during the report period. And in this measure, we're counting a person's last exit from the homelessness system, where they did not return to any other project in the system within 14 days after the exit. So we know folks have many times have multiple exits from different project types throughout a year. We're only counting them once here, and we're looking at that last exit during the year. And it does count people who also moved into a permanent housing unit during the year and remain enrolled in their permanent housing project at the end of the year. That is a significant change from the earlier version. So you may see a difference in your numbers there because we are now including those folks who, while technically still in the system, meaning they're still in HMIS, they have moved into permanent housing. And it also includes exits to housing outside the homelessness response system, which it did in the past as well. And now to those permanent housing within the homelessness response system. So that's the big change there. Jules, do you want to talk about the detail tab a little on exits?
Yeah, and so in this one, you know, if you had been looking at the detail tab in the past, this change to measure 3 will not seem that significant to you. Really, all that it's doing is shifting which one is being called forward as the top line measure. Both of these concepts were always articulated here because we understand that it's important to understand both those who have actually exited the system and moved into permanent housing, as well as those who have successfully moved into permanent housing by remaining within the system. By remaining housed in a permanent housing project that participates in HMIS. So you might not have been able to pick those folks up in the top line measure before, but now the state has decided to look at that, that sort of bottom row, if you will. We'll get to what these rows are in a minute, instead of the top row. And so up here, this breaks out those system exits by 2 groups. The top set of rows up at the top are all about those folks who have actually exited the system. So if they remained enrolled in permanent housing at the end of the calendar year or reporting period that we're looking at, they're not included here. Okay, these are for folks who have system exits, and that means that they have not returned. They have an exit after which they have not returned for those 14 days, as Melissa said. And so what we're looking at for that specific exit, whichever one was the last one in the report period, we are then breaking that out by which kind of project did they exit from. So these rows below the 704 there, the 71, the 598, 19, 3, and 13 should sum up to that 704. These are mutually exclusive. Each person only has one system exit that's being looked at. They are always being looked at the last one in the report period. Determine if that last one was successful. You can see all exits are in the middle row. That's everybody who did exit. And then whether that was successful is shown in that first row. And so you can then look at that broken out by what type of project they exited from. And this can tell you something about the relative success rates of the different kinds of projects that are serving your system. You would expect to see a much lower success rate for folks coming off the street, for folks coming out of emergency housing, than you would than for folks coming out of permanent supportive housing or the like. Ideally, that would be something that would make logical sense and would be consistent with a system that seems to be functioning well. Now then, in this middle section, we just call out those folks who are still enrolled at the end of the year with that permanent housing move-in date. Okay, so this row is just those folks who at the end of the year, they are still enrolled in a permanent housing project. They have a move-in date at some point during the report period, not at some point during their enrollment. If they moved in last year or the year before that, that doesn't count for this year. That counted in that year. So if the move-in date falls in this year, then you're going to see that here. So anyone who's still enrolled in the project is shown in that all active clients row in the middle. And then those who moved into housing, the subset of those who moved into housing is shown in the first column. And then the percentage in that last column. And then down on the bottom row, you're going to see the unduplicated combination of those two groups. Because some folks could exit, maybe in January they exited from some kind of project and they didn't come back for a while. And then later in the year, they might have had an enrollment in permanent housing and successfully moved in. So they might have had a system exit and a permanent housing move in. We don't want to reflect them both in the top line measure, so they get unduplicated down there. They're going to count as a success, but just one time, both in the numerator and the denominator. And that's how that breakout works for measure 3. And it's the exact same, and we'll talk about measure 6 shortly. So there we
go. Thanks, Jules. And just a reminder, if anyone has any questions, feel free to, I see a few questions in the Q&A box, but feel free to put those in there and we will either write back or respond verbally as we go along. So I'm going to talk now about measure 4, which is the length of time that persons remained homeless. So that's the average number of days that people experienced homelessness during the year. It does include any days that overlap the first day of the year in a continuous day. So if, for example, someone entered in December and they were still experiencing homelessness in that project and their enrollment went into the next year, that whole time will be counted. As well as any other days they experienced homelessness during that year. And so we averaged those, and it also, so it includes any days people were enrolled in entry-exit emergency shelter, transitional housing and safe havens. That's pretty straightforward. Between the day the person entered and the day they exited, those days count. Then there are also days when they're enrolled in night-by-night emergency shelters, but that's based on, there's some adjustments made based on when bed nights were recorded. And if you are interested in more details on that, there are the supporting documents that are on CalICH's website go into that more. And I will point you towards those later in the presentation. Just to know that there are some slight nuances to how days homeless is calculated for different project types. And then also for permanent housing projects, we're counting any days between a person's project start date and the date they moved into permanent housing, when they got that housing move-in date. It also includes days people were enrolled in non-residential projects based on when they had recorded homeless living situation. So again, I would point you towards the supporting documents for more details on those calculations. Because it's a little more nuanced than with the more straightforward transitional housing or safe haven or entry exit shelters. Then there's no changes specifically to measure 4. However, those adjustments, those improvements that we talked about that were made to the methodology throughout the SPMs do affect some of the calculations around length of time homeless, because some people may be removed or added. And so you will see some slight, you'll see some differences in the new data. And then Jules, do you want to talk about the detail for measure 4?
Yeah, I'll also just sort of add on to that, which is that measure 4 was probably the one that was most impacted by bug fixes as well. So I just want to be transparent about that. Just, just to be clear about that. This one, unfortunately, I didn't grab all of the title there, but it's the same measure. And this one is broken out just by the days, the type of days that the person counted as homeless. So if the day that they experienced homelessness was in an emergency shelter or safe haven, that day shows up in the first row. Transition, if it was spent in transitional housing, and then that accumulative total of those sheltered homeless days is below that. This one is not mathing up right. And this looks like an old one that's all funky, but they do actually math up right. And then additional days homeless in street outreach. So all of these days are unduplicated, and each day is given only one of these assignments. So if a person was enrolled in 2 different projects at the same time, the one that is highest up on this list is given the priority. There's a slight, it's actually not quite exactly what's on this list. There's a list in the specs, but they are ordered in a certain priority order so that, you know, if a person has 2 different enrollments, they're getting the one that reflects the most use of the homeless system, I guess, if I would say that. So if a person, for example, was enrolled in emergency shelter at the same time they were in street outreach, well, that's very likely to happen. That happens often. People are out on the streets during the day, sleeping in shelters at night, but we only show them as having that day as being in shelter. The days then that we have where they do not have anything else other than a touch point in street outreach, day shelter, or coordinated entry, which basically means a current living situation or the date of their move in on a prior living situation, and then the sort of 15 days around those current living situations. Those days are then counted as homeless in street outreach, day shelter, coordinated entry, continuous with the report period. And then again, that sort of like final layer is if they have days prior to move in, they haven't been contacted by street outreach, they're not in an emergency shelter at that time, but we also have that information that they were waiting for their housing unit before they moved in. We will also count those days. And all of those days should sum up then to the cumulative total, which they do not do in this illustration, but that's because it's a poor choice of illustrations, but I believe they should in your the ones that you were emailed. And if they don't, you should definitely get in touch with us. I'll turn it back over then to Melissa to talk about returns.
Yes, thank you, Julie.
Unless there are any questions, I suppose, about measure.
I'm not seeing any specific to that measure, so but if people have any questions specific to the measures, again, you can put it in the Q&A at any time, and if we don't get to it on that specific slide, we will respond either at the end of the webinar, or we can also provide some Q&A later as well. So I'm going to talk about measure 5 now. That's the number of persons who return to homelessness after exiting homelessness to permanent housing. And I am just realizing that the snapshot got covered over with measure 6, and I thought I had fixed that, but so ignore the picture there because that is for the next measure. Measure 5 is the percent of people who return to homelessness within 6 months of exiting the homelessness response system to permanent housing. So it's people, so it's a percentage, it's a rate, it's the return rate, and that is based on the people who return 6 months after their exit. So we're just looking at that 6-month rate for the top line measure. And just like with exits, where people exit more than once, people can have multiple returns after an exit, right? Multiple exits and multiple returns. For the purposes of measure 5, we're only counting the person's first system exit within the year and then their first return after that. So that way, if someone exited, returned, and then exited again, we're not missing that return, right? It also includes people who return to any COC in the state within 6 months after they exited the homelessness response system to permanent housing. So it'll get counted in the SPMs for the COC where they exited from. What we do look to see if someone returned to another COC in the state. So that is important to note when you may be, and we'll talk a little bit more on a later slide about differences between these SPMs and some of the other HUD reporting, their SPMs, but that is going to be a key difference as well because we have data on every COC in the state in HVIS. One of the key changes, improvements since the last version of the SPMs related to those methodology changes, it's all kind of related to the same changes that affect all the measures in some way. There's nothing specific about returns that was changed. So just refer back to those adjustments and those bug fixes. And that also might explain why you'll see some differences from your original data. I'll turn it over to Jules.
Yeah, and then this breakout, it looks very busy, but it's actually fairly simple. It's so each of the exits is shown from which they exited, basically. So if they exited from an emergency shelter, they're shown in that second chunk of lines. If their exit was from rapid rehousing, permanent supportive housing with a move-in date, without a move-in date, or from one of the non-residential projects types, then each of those are broken out. Those are mutually exclusive again, because we're always only looking at one exit per client. In this case, we're looking at the earliest exit in the report period to see if they have returned at some point during that report period or 6 months after. If the report period, in all cases, we look 6 months ahead. So sometimes that goes outside of the report period if the person exited on the last day of the report period, for example. And then in the second column there, what you'll see is each of those exits is broken out by what type of exit it was. Was it an exit to one of the permanent destinations, one of the temporary destinations, or to an unknown destination? And for each of those sections, then we show you how many people actually exited during the report period, had one of those system exits during the report period, and how many of those people returned within the 6 months following their individual return exit date. And then we show you that rate. The actual, the rate is what is used as the measure, I believe, in this case. Or actually, I think the number might be used in this case, but then the rate is maybe used in the measure 7. That's how measure 5 is broken down for returns. Again, it looks a little gnarly, but it's really just showing you where they left from, where they were going, where they said they were going to, and then whether they came back or not. And then we'll turn it over back to Melissa just for our last measure, which is one time. It's essentially a breakout of one of the other measures in some respects, a little nuanced variation on one of the other measures.
Thanks. So measure 6, that's the last of the main six performance measures, is successful placements from street outreach projects. So it is somewhat of a little bit of a subset of that measure 3 system exits. There's some slight, differences the way it's calculated, but we're just looking at placements out of street outreach projects. And when we look at placements to housing or to other situations outside of street outreach, we also look at exits to emergency shelters, safe havens, transitional housing, as well as those typical permanent housing destinations, and to temporary housing in some institutional settings. So it's a little bit of, for the folks that are in street outreach, it's a broader universe of exit destinations that are considered successful because these are folks who are experiencing unsheltered homelessness, and we're trying to get them into safe residential spaces, even if that's not permanent housing. So it's slightly different than system exits in that way, but we do also, similar to measure 3, count a person's last exit from street outreach during the year. So if people have more than one exit from street outreach, we're only counting that last exit. So they're only counted once in this measure. And there aren't any details on, I'll go back real quick. there aren't any details on Measure 6 broken out because it is already just that one project type, and it's pretty straightforward. So I'm going to jump ahead to Measure 7, which is a little more unconventional measure than the other 6, but it's also on the detail tab. You'll find it on the detail tabs. And that is supporting data on how the COC has performed on each of the previous 6 SPMs, but then it breaks those numbers out for each SPM for specific population groups. So those groups include household composition. So that would be households with children, without children, or with only children. I won't read all of the population groups, but just to give you a sense of what we're looking at in Measure 7. It also breaks it up by gender, ethnicity, and race, and then some other subpopulation characteristics. There's some data on youth, veterans, some other characteristics that would be of interest to kind of point towards any underserved or disproportionately impacted populations. So when you go to the detail tab, you'll see that list of all those specific population groups, and then see how those groups performed on, Measure 1A, and then you'll see those numbers for the newly homeless, the length of time they were homeless, the exits, etc. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the key differences between HUD and California's SPMs and the benefits of California's approach. I saw in the Q&A, and I know this is a question that has come up a lot in the previous round of SPMs. I know a lot of folks are kind of comparing the numbers here with numbers they've seen in other reporting that they've done to HUD out of their HMIS, whether it's an the HUD SPMs or another reporting, and kind of wondering, why do these numbers look different? Well, there's some good reasons for that. The California SPMs include data from several types of non-residential projects. That's I would say one of the biggest differences. The HUD SPMs do report on exits from street outreach, but other than that, they don't include those services only projects, coordinated entry, etc. So those folks are counted across the California SPM. So you'll see differences in your data here against the HUD SPM report because of that. So there are also some more data quality adjustments in the California SPMs for those non-residential projects to more accurately determine if and for how long people who are enrolled in those projects were experiencing homelessness. And then the California SPMs are also disaggregated for specific population groups. That's that Measure 7 that we talked about. That provides you as the grantee with more detailed information about how those different groups experience homelessness in your system. And another key difference is that the California SPMs combine data from all the COCs in the state, because we have that data in HDIS, and HDIS has that data on all the COCs in the state, and it gives you and the state a much more complete picture of homelessness for people who move between COCs. So that comes into play mostly with Measure 2 and with Measure 5, returns. I'm trying to remember that for a second. Looking at people who are newly homeless and those who return to homelessness. So those measures are going to look a little different because we're also factoring in how people experienced homelessness and whether they did in other COCs. All right, so now we're going to turn it over to Amber to talk about some additional resources.
Thank you, Melissa and Jules. So the CalACH data research team and Apt Associates have developed helpful resources to provide a more thorough understanding of the California System Performance Measures. These resources include the California System Performance Measures Guide and Glossary. This provides an overview of the California SPMs and detailed information on each SPM. It also includes ways to use the data provided and a glossary of key terms and definitions. Separately, we have developed a crosswalk document that compares the California SPMs and HUD SPMs, including the key differences between the two. I believe that Joyce had put the link to the crosswalk in the chat, and these resources can be found on our website. Next slide, please. So we are aware that this is a lot of information, and we want to ensure that we provide you with different types of assistance to support you in reviewing and utilizing the SPM data. We do encourage you to save and reference the resources mentioned in the prior slide. In addition, we have scheduled a drop-in session where you will be able to ask questions pertaining to the California SPMs and the baseline data. The registration link for this drop-in session was provided in the email that contains the data that we sent last Friday, and I will also be adding it to the chat. We are also available to talk with you one-on-one about your specific data. If you would like to talk with us, please reach out to the HDIS email address and request that an individual meeting is scheduled. I believe that that includes our walkthrough for the California SPMs. We look forward to collaborating with you more on this data, and I will pass it back to App to see if we have any time for questions.
Thanks, Amber. There are a couple, I think 2 or 3 questions that I think we can respond to now. The first one, there was a question about very different numbers between the California SPMs and their own pool of SPMs, which could be referring to the HUD SPMs, or potentially, a COC or an HMIS administrator is recreating some of the data in their HMIS. And hopefully the slide about the key differences, which maybe I can go back to for a second, addresses some of those concerns. There will be some differences in the numbers. That's completely normal. So, not surprising. If you are still concerned, even after thinking about how those numbers are impacted by the non-residential projects, some of the differences in the methodology and the data quality adjustments that we're doing in the California SPMs, you can reach out for additional TA. You can come to our drop-in session as well, and we can talk through more of the details of the calculations. And there are also those links to the companion guide, or I forget what we're calling it now, the Understanding the SPMs guide. And also there's a crosswalk between the HUD SPMs and the California ones. So I would highly recommend reviewing those before anyone becomes alarmed about huge differences. And then if that still doesn't really resolve the questions, we can have more of a one-on-one discussion where we can really unpack what's going on there. And then I'll answer one more question, and then there's one I think Jules can answer, although maybe you can answer this next one too, Jules. But there was a question about the race and ethnicity methodology for measure 7, and let me see if I can pull up the slide here. So whether Hispanic or Latino, Latina is considered its own race or ethnicity. The template version now and is based on the data as collected in HMIS for the last set of data standards, which race and ethnicity are 2 separate fields, and I'm seeing it, and it's also in the template. You can see a crosswalk of the 2, so you'll see that combination of race and ethnicity for certain categories. I think once you look at that template, it'll be clear how it's calculated. I don't know, Jules, if you have any.
Yeah, I mean, I would just say these are all based on the data that are collected, and they were collected under those old data standards. That will change starting, that started HUD changed the way those data are collected to just be one field now, where you can choose any sort of combination of Hispanic and any other race or no other race if you want to. And those are all grouped under kind of a race category. And so that will change with the uploads that you guys will start submitting in, or that you have probably submitting right now and need to be done submitting in a couple of days. But until that data are loaded and that's the year that we're looking at, we will not see that kind of change to the demographics. Until then, we have to sort of stick with the data we're given, which is that they're two separate things. And then I also wanted to respond to the question someone asked about Measure 4 and just clarify, and I did clarify in writing, but I also want to make sure to do so verbally in case anyone's not looking at the Q&A. I apologize. I said that those rows should add up. What we're showing you there are averages. Those should not add up. However, rest assured that when we validated your data, we were looking at two different things. We were looking at the actual clients that had days and then the count of days that they had. And we made sure that if we were looking at a cumulative count, it was the summation of days from the breakout, its constitutional breakout parts, and everything added up. So rest assured that those are validated as if in the way that I described, but they should not add up in what we're showing you. And then I think there's a question for Amber.
Which question? Sorry.
So the question, Amber, for you is, will Cal ICH and APT provide a goal setting tool for HAP 5? That tool is very helpful in prior rounds.
So we do not have a goal setting tool for this round. There will be more information that we will be talking about in the future around setting goals towards this data. So we're at this point, we're not looking at creating a new tool. I understand that was helpful. What we can do is take a look at the tool that was provided previously and see if there's any benefit to us updating that, and definitely get back to you. But we hear you that is a beneficial tool, and I will look into that with Sydney.
We only have a few minutes left. If anyone has any final questions, feel free to put them in the Q&A. I just put up again the slide with the additional resources that we mentioned a few times. And I believe the links are in the chat, but those, yeah, they are in the chat, just double checking. But those, that system performance measure guiding glossary goes through what's in the template, how things are calculated. It's not at like a very, it's not as detailed as like a technical specifications document, but it gives you some more details if you're wondering how they're calculated. And there's a glossary as well. I highly recommend reviewing that if you are, you have questions about how those measures are being calculated. And there's also that comparison of the California and the HUD system performance measures, which are two separate reports, just to be clear. We're not submitting California's SPMs to HUD. Those are separate. So I know a lot of folks are used to those HUD measures though, so it might be a good thing to look at that comparison.
I just wanted to share one more time that the workbooks with the data were sent out last Friday. They were sent out to the contacts that we have on file. As you know, it's hard to ensure that we have every contact that needs this data in our records. So if you feel you did not receive that information, please just reach out to the HDIS inbox, and we can get you a copy of what was sent to your region. And the data was sent out regionally. So we included the COC and the county and the large city if applicable. I see one final question on the goal setting tool that I'd like to address quickly. We did remove that resource from the prior round of HAP just because we needed to, we didn't want to cause any confusion with the release of this baseline data. And like I mentioned previously, we didn't have an intention to provide an updated tool, but I will take a look at that tool with Sydney and see if we have the ability to create something for you in the future. And Jess, I can definitely share that resource with you since it has been removed from our website, and you can determine if it will be helpful to you in its current state.
I think we're at time. So thank you all for coming. And we will be in touch soon with additional resources, the slides, and maybe see you at the drop-in session.
Thank you.